For almost 200 years, Sweden stood apart. Not weak, not isolated, but deliberately separate. It was a country that built its national identity around neutrality, non-alignment, independence, and the quiet confidence that it could protect itself without joining any military alliance. But now, that era is over. Sweden is inside NATO, and this is not just a new flag outside NATO headquarters. This is not just another country added to a list. This is a psychological earthquake for Sweden and a strategic nightmare for Russia. Because when Sweden joined NATO, the map of Northern Europe changed overnight. The Baltic Sea, once a tense gray zone between NATO and Russia, suddenly became surrounded almost entirely by NATO territory. Finland is in NATO, Norway is in NATO, Denmark is in NATO, the Baltic states are in NATO, Poland and Germany are in NATO, and now Sweden is also inside the alliance. So the real question is not only why Sweden joined NATO, the real question is what NATO now gains from Sweden, and why this one decision makes the Baltic region far more dangerous, far more connected, and far more difficult for Russia to challenge. Before we go deeper, take a second to like the video and subscribe. To understand how massive this shift is, you have to understand Sweden's old self-image. For generations, many Swedes took pride in being non-aligned. It was part of the national story. Sweden was not a small country hiding from history. Sweden saw itself as independent, rational, humanitarian, and capable of standing outside the great power blocks. That position gave Sweden diplomatic weight and allowed it to speak in a different tone. It became part of how the nation saw itself. So when Sweden finally joined NATO, it was not just a defense decision, it was an identity-level U-turn. And honestly, this is the part most people miss. They talk about tanks, jets, submarines, and budgets. But behind all of that, there is a deeper emotional shift.
A country that once said, "We stay outside alliances," is now saying the threat is too serious to stand alone. That is not a small adjustment. That is a national confession that the old security model no longer fits the world after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From my personal view, this is what makes Sweden's NATO entry so powerful. It is not only strategic, it is symbolic. It tells Europe that even countries with long traditions of neutrality now believe the rules of the game have changed. The first thing NATO gets from Sweden is simple: geography. In war, geography is not background, geography is destiny. Look at the map. Sweden sits like a massive aircraft carrier along the western edge of the Baltic Sea. From Swedish territory, NATO can think differently about defending the Baltic states. Before Sweden and Finland joined, NATO's northern defense planning had gaps. There was fragmentation, political limitation, operational complication, and uncertainty. But now, NATO can plan the defense of Northern Europe as one connected theater. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Poland, Germany, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania can now be linked into a more complete defense system. That matters because if a crisis ever erupts in the Baltic region, time will be everything. Reinforcements, air defense, naval patrols, intelligence, logistics, fuel, ammunition, and medical evacuation all depend on access. Sweden gives NATO access to airspace, ports, territory, staging areas, and the central Baltic. This is why Sweden's membership is so important. It makes NATO's defense planning less like a broken chain and more like a closed shield. But geography alone is not enough. The Baltic Sea is not a normal sea. It is shallow, narrow, crowded, and full of islands, coastlines, commercial traffic, undersea cables, pipelines, and invisible military pressure. In deep oceans, big navies can disappear. But in the Baltic, everything is closer, faster, and more dangerous. Submarines operate differently, mines become more important, small ships can be deadly, coastal missiles can dominate large areas, electronic warfare can blind systems in minutes. This is where Sweden brings something NATO desperately values: experience. The Swedish Navy has spent decades preparing for exactly this environment. Sweden understands the Baltic's shallow waters, hidden approaches, island chains, and coastal defense requirements in a way few outsiders can match. This is not theoretical knowledge. This is home field knowledge. In any future crisis, that knowledge could be the difference between NATO reacting late and NATO moving first. Now let's talk about capability. Sweden is not joining NATO empty-handed. It brings a serious air force, a highly professional navy, advanced submarines, strong coastal defense experience, and one of Europe's most respected defense industries. The Gripen fighter is designed with a very Swedish logic: survive, disperse, operate from roads, and keep fighting even when major bases are under threat. That is important because modern war has shown us one brutal lesson. Fixed bases are targets. Runways can be hit. Fuel depots can be hit. Command centers can be hit. Aircraft parked in predictable locations can be destroyed before they ever take off. Sweden's military culture has long understood this. Dispersed operations are not a new fashion for Sweden. They are part of its defense DNA. Now NATO gets access to that mindset, not just Swedish hardware, but Swedish doctrine: how to operate under pressure, how to move quickly, how to hide, and how to keep fighting when the battlefield is being watched by satellites, drones, and long-range missiles. That is extremely valuable. And here is where the story becomes even more serious. Sweden is not simply entering NATO and relaxing under Article 5 protection. Sweden is spending, modernizing, and preparing for a much bigger role. Its 2026 military defense budget rises sharply, showing that Sweden is not treating NATO membership as a substitute for national defense. It is treating NATO membership as a multiplier. The latest naval developments also prove this. Sweden has selected Naval Group for 4 new FDI frigates under the Luleå project, and that is a major signal. Sweden's Navy has traditionally focused heavily on the Baltic environment, with smaller and highly capable ships. But new frigates mean Sweden wants greater air defense, longer reach, and a stronger role inside NATO's wider maritime structure.
This is Sweden saying, we are no longer just defending our own coastline, we are preparing to defend the alliance. That is a dramatic change. And then came Aurora 26, where more than 18,000 troops from 13 countries trained in Sweden. Think about that for a second. Sweden, once outside NATO, is now hosting and integrating allied forces into its own defense plans. That is not symbolism anymore. That is rehearsal. That is the alliance practicing how to move, fight, reinforce, and survive in the Nordic-Baltic theater. So why does this matter to Russia? Because Russia's Baltic position is now much more exposed. Kaliningrad remains heavily militarized. The Russian Baltic fleet still matters. Hybrid warfare, undersea sabotage, and gray zone pressure remain real threats. But the strategic balance has shifted. Before, Russia could look at the Baltic region and see political gaps. Now it sees a much more unified NATO perimeter. And this is the nightmare for any military planner. A region where your opponent controls more airspace, more coastlines, more sensors, more ports, and more reinforcement routes. Sweden gives NATO depth. Finland gives NATO a massive land frontier. Denmark controls key maritime access. Norway connects the Arctic and North Atlantic. The Baltic states create forward pressure. Together, this creates a northern wall, and Sweden is one of the central stones in that wall. My opinion, Sweden's NATO membership is one of the most important European security shifts of the last decade. Not because Sweden alone changes everything, but because Sweden completes something. It completes the Nordic NATO map.
It completes the Baltic defense picture. It completes the psychological break from Europe's old post-Cold War assumptions. For years, many European countries believed war was something that happened elsewhere. Ukraine destroyed that illusion. Sweden's decision shows how deeply that shock has entered European thinking. A peaceful, careful, highly developed country looked at the security environment and decided neutrality was no longer enough. That should tell us everything. This was not a reckless decision. This was a reluctant decision, and sometimes reluctant decisions are the most serious ones. So Sweden's NATO entry is not just a membership story, It is a story about identity, fear, geography, and history turning a corner. For Sweden, it means leaving behind a proud tradition of non-alignment. For NATO, it means gaining territory, capability, planning depth, and a powerful Baltic specialist. For Russia, it means the northern map has become much harder to challenge. The Baltic Sea has not become peaceful, it has become more militarized, more monitored, and more strategically important than ever. The next crisis in Northern Europe may not begin with tanks crossing a border. It may begin under the sea, with a damaged cable, a suspicious ship, a drone over a base, or a submarine contact in shallow water. And when that moment comes, Sweden will no longer be standing outside the alliance, watching carefully from the edge. Sweden will be inside the room, inside the plan, and inside the shield. That is the real meaning of this NATO U-turn. It is not just a change in policy, it is a change in history. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, did Sweden make the right decision, or has NATO just made the Baltic Sea more dangerous? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.